So hi, my name's Maggie Feinstein, and I'm the director of the 1027 Healing Partnership. We're an organization here in Pittsburgh that was started after the shooting at the Tree of Life Synagogue on October 27, 2018. The 1027 Healing Partnership provides support resources to promote healing and resiliency to all members of the greater Pittsburgh community, regardless of whether they were impacted directly or indirectly by the shooting. We believe that by centering victims in attacked communities as leaders, it allows people to build a new relationship and understanding that are crucial to healing. For 4 years after the attack, there was no timeline for what would happen through the justice system related to the pending charges to hold accountability for the person who killed 11 Jewish worshipers and engaged in gun battle with the police. He entered the synagogue at the beginning of Shabbat services on a Saturday morning. In addition to those murdered, there were 11 people who were unable to worship that morning despite coming to services, though fortunately they survived. To apprehend this individual, it required the efforts of hundreds of police, fire, and EMS. 63-count indictment named the victims related to this act, congregants and staff of the 3 congregations who witnessed it, family members of the 11, and injured police officers. By being victimized in this attack, they then played a crucial role in the justice process through bringing themselves and the memories of their loved ones bravely to the front of the courtroom. The Western District of Pennsylvania's U.S. Attorney's Office began the trial on behalf of the government. Jury selection started in April of this year, and the trial was held by the Honorable Judge Colville. 12 jurors and 6 alternates were sworn in at the end of May, and they heard the guilty phase of the trial. By June 16th, the jury found this person guilty on all 63 charges, which included obstruction of religious freedom. The second phase of the trial then began on June 26th to establish if he was eligible to receive a death sentence under the federal statutes. And on July 13th, the jury unanimously found that he was eligible. During that final penalty phase, the jury sentenced him to death on 22 eligible capital offenses. Throughout this long and arduous process, the federal courthouse of Pittsburgh responded to the gravity and the breadth of this trial accordingly. They had a public overflow courtroom, but also allotted another courtroom for the duration to be private overflow just for the named victims. There were additional court security staff who took time to get to know our very large group who was there every day. Court marshals rotated through from across the country, and all the while there was incredible care for dignity and humanity of all of us. In the time between the attack and when the jury delivered the verdict, many of those named in the indictment had remained quiet in an effort to not undermine the process. Yet they heard people speaking for them or about them. Repeatedly, it was said that there should be no trial to spare re-traumatizing this group of people, that a plea deal would clearly be the preferred route. Not surprisingly, every individual has their own deeply personal opinion based on their own worldview and life experience. Today, you'll hear from just a few of our community members about their experience. In addition, a targeted attack on a group of people leaves an immense number of vicarious trauma throughout the community and the grief of many people who were honored to know the 11 people in our community. Please know that these folks are going to speak only for themselves and that there's no right way to view the justice after an attack that is motivated by hate. This experience was long and trying and beautiful and inspiring, and it still remains hard to fully comprehend for many in our community. This panel is the first time that these guys have spoken publicly about shedding a light on the experience from the perspective of their own experience. But I hope you'll get to hear some of the wisdom and insight from other community members as well, and hopefully here in the conference. So that's me, and that's why we're here. So I'm gonna now ask you guys to just share with people, if you can introduce yourself and give a little bit of how you're connected to this trial.
My name is Amy Mallinger. My grandmother was killed in the Tree of Life Synagogue. Her name was Rose Mallinger. She was 97 years old, and she was filled with life despite being 97. And one of the things about her is her family meant everything to her, and everyone she met on the street remembered her, mostly because she was very small, but also because she was just such a joyous person and she just loved living life.
I'm Audrey Glickman. I was inside the Tree of Life building leading the service for a Tree of Life congregation when the shooter came in.
I'm Jodi Kart. My father was Melvin Wax. He was one of the victims. My dad was just a very happy man. He was extremely content in life, and the two important things to him were his family and his faith.
Good afternoon. My name is Michele Rosenthal. My brothers Cecil and David Rosenthal were murdered at the Tree of Life Synagogue. Cecil and David were both special needs, and the synagogue was a place that they felt safe in.
Good afternoon. My name is Jonathan Craig. I'm a sergeant with the Pittsburgh Police. I've been a member of Pittsburgh SWAT for 10 years, a team leader for 8, and a sniper for 5. I was one of the many, many officers that responded to the Tree of Life on the morning of October 27th.
Thank you, John. And I want to say the empty seat is also for Officer Timothy Matson, who couldn't be with us today, unfortunately, but I know he was on the agenda. He is really a beacon of inspiration for a lot of people, and hopefully you'll get to hear him speak in the future. But he responded that day. He was on the force for 18 years, 2 years on SWAT before October 27th, and because of the injuries he sustained when breaching the room, he took him about 2 years to recover before he could return to the force. But he's wonderful, and hopefully you'll get to see him sometime. So thank you all for introducing yourselves. I'm gonna start with you, Audrey. As this was an entirely new experience of being through a trial like this, what did you think you knew or think about before the trial, and what did you take away from the experience?
Well, good question. So I had worked with attorneys, and I had some idea of what goes on in a courtroom, and I knew that it would be dreary and boring to watch the jury selection, so I didn't do that. But even before any of it started, I knew that we had to have the trial for information to come forward. And because I couldn't talk about the trial, because I was a witness, and witnesses shouldn't talk about the case, the bad guy, or the trial itself, or potential punishments beforehand so that we don't risk a mistrial later, I couldn't talk about it. So even while other people were talking for me about what I want and don't want, I couldn't say anything. So I did have some idea that, yes, we needed a trial.
And then what did you say you kind of took away or learned from that experience, just as broadly as possible?
Well, broadly speaking, it would be very nice if the general public would not presume to be speaking on behalf of any victims, whether right or wrong in their opinions. They're punditing and commenting and saying, well, they shouldn't want a trial, and they don't need a trial, and Jewish people don't believe something, or it's bad to have the death penalty, or whatever they were saying certainly didn't reflect what I thought, and yet I couldn't speak. So after something like this happens, we should be careful who we're listening to.
So Audrey, you're sort of saying about the politicizing or moralizing about this trial specifically when you were a victim and other people were having political opinions or moral opinions about what was right or wrong?
Yes, yes, they did. They had a whole lot of opinions. Mm-hmm. If we hadn't had the trial, we would not have known all the details of what happened. We would not have known all of the hate that was behind what this person did. We wouldn't have known every little detail of his life before that and how it developed. We wouldn't have known our own story because we still hadn't put it together among ourselves. And we wouldn't have known if you'll all forgive me, the fact that he didn't just come in and shoot up a crowd. He brutally murdered each individual person. And if there ever was a hate crime, that's it. And to say that we should sweep him under the rug and just give him life in prison, which he would have liked, as it turned out, is wrong to do. There's a reason why the laws are what they are, and if we want to change the laws, we have lawmakers to do that, but changing it by judicial precedent of not putting him not giving him a sentence of death, which effectively cuts him off from society. It's not a punishment, it's not a death penalty, really. It's a sentence of death to separate him from society and not have influence on everyone else. It goes back to the Bible that's the meaning of that.
So I'm gonna ask Jodi, because Audrey, you said you've been to court before, you had some experience working for lawyers. Jodi, going into this experience, was there anything that you sort of knew or expected going into it, and how did you manage your expectations?
So I had no experience whatsoever with the courtroom or with the trial. This was all new to me. I had no idea what to anticipate. I can say that one of my biggest fears was being in the same space as the perpetrator. I wasn't quite sure how I was going to handle that day in, day out for over 2 months. But we were offered a tour of the courtroom prior to the trial, and that was incredibly impactful. I just remember walking into the courtroom, and to the right, seeing the jury box and seeing those empty seats and knowing that 12 strangers were going to make this decision for us. And I realized for the first time how impactful a jury truly is. And seeing the witness stand and just feeling the gravity of what was coming. But it was also very helpful, so that the first day of trial was not the first time that I stepped into that courtroom.
Thank you. Michele, Audrey talked a little bit about the truth coming out and having facts that were sort of put out there. Why is that important? Why would you say that for you that might have been an important piece to this process?
I think people, and I probably assumed, that when you go into a trial, you have all of the facts, or the families have all of the facts. For 4.5 years, we tried to piece together from talking to each other to figure out the puzzle. And as my amazing therapist has explained, it's like you have a puzzle and you have 50% of the puzzle, and then during the trial, you get unbelievable details that, frankly, most of them happened within the first day of hearing the 911 calls, but you get the other pieces of the puzzle. But in the end, we never get all of the pieces, so the few pieces that are missing, we still have to create in our minds.
Thank you. And Amy, for you, I mean, you've also never experienced anything like this before. What did you anticipate, and what would you say you really took from the experience?
I didn't really know what to anticipate. I think something that you try to do before trial is you try to prepare yourself emotionally, but there's never any amount of preparation that could prepare you for what you're about to hear. I remember the first day in opening statements, the attorney started talking about my grandmother, and I just lost all of my emotions that I thought I had worked on so much, but you can't prepare yourself for that. So I think something that I took away from it is just to be kind to yourself and to lean on all of the people around you that are going through the exact same thing, because the room that we were in, the 6B room that we called ourselves, it was something that was very powerful and very healing for all of us to be a part of, and to be able to go back to every day after we were sitting in the courtroom, and to be able to talk to each other about what we were going through.
What do you think the power was of being in that private overflow courtroom with your peers?
When you're going through something like this, everybody else is living their lives like nothing is going on, but this is your entire life. This is everything that you've been talking about for us for 4.5 years, and people don't understand that, except for the people that are in that room with you. So, for example, when you testify for your loved one, it's not something that's easy to do, but we all had to do it because of our loved ones, and we could all lean on each other because we all just went through that experience. So we knew right before everybody was a bit nervous and everyone was a little bit scared. So we knew before, give them a little space, but afterwards, everyone was very encouraging, and it was just so nice to be a part of that community.
Thank you. And John, I'll kind of go to you to piggyback on what Amy was saying, because you've been to more court cases than probably any of us before and asked to testify before. But in this case, you testified in a very different way. What was unique about the testimony you gave in this case compared to what you would do normally on your job? And how did you sort of find that experience?
This experience was different because normally in the, I guess, giving testimony during normal work-related incidents, it's just a statement of fact, observations that I experienced at the time. This was different because instead of giving testimony, I was asked to give a victim impact statement. So it was more of a mix of facts and emotions that I experienced.
Can you share a little bit about, sort of piggybacking on what Amy was talking about, what did you find in the courthouse after you gave that victim impact statement, how people viewed you, or whether or not, you know, as a newer comer to the group, how that worked for you?
My experience was that I was extremely embarrassed afterwards. I was very emotional while giving my statement, but everyone that was in the courtroom, people that I didn't know, later on, jurors, the family members, other victims, were the kindest and most supportive people that I've ever met in my life.
I definitely could agree with that. And I think that, you know, to say that emotional, I appreciated what Amy just said also about how the vulnerability was shared, that kind of everybody who was part of that space was vulnerable together, and there was nobody who was spared that experience, and so they understood how hard it was to get emotional in a public way, but also how inevitable it is given how important this conversation was. Amy, I'm going to ask you also, so this was very public, and people, as you sort of said, that you were living this life and other people were going on about their life. After it was over, did you feel like people looked at you any differently or related to you any differently?
I don't think people looked at me different. I think people kind of got the bravery to come talk to me about what was happening to me. A lot of the things that people assume about you is that you're fragile and that people shouldn't talk about what just happened to your family, but that's kind of the opposite of how I felt. I liked hearing people's stories. I liked hearing what they were doing that day or how it affected them. And I think it gave people a lot of bravery to be able to do that. Even people I work with were coming up to me and telling me they saw me on the news and they heard about my grandmother and she must have been such a wonderful person. And for me and my family, it's very important to keep her story alive. So I will tell her story every single day, anybody who asks me. So it enabled me to do that.
So afterwards, people had heard the stories or read the stories, and then they were able to talk to you about them a little bit.
Yeah, they learned about Rose.
Jodi, do you mind speaking a little bit to that as well? Because I think similar to what Amy was talking about that whether people knew how to interact with you prior to the trial, did it help?
Yeah, I think, you know, prior to and during, I think people felt that I was very fragile, and I felt like I was radiating trauma. People were very kind, but I think they were also, you know, very careful in choosing their words. And it is difficult. It's difficult to know what to say, which was why, and this isn't the question you asked, but all of us being together was immensely helpful because we could say anything to anybody, and we knew that everybody would understand because we were all going through the same thing. And then afterward, I think people, you know, it was almost a sense of relief. And while that is true, there is truth to that, this never goes away. You live with it for the rest of your life, every single day. So there's not closure for me, but this piece of the book, this chapter, has closed. But it will be with me for the rest of my life.
Thank you. And Audrey, do you mind kind of picking up where Jodi left off about the chapters? Because you talked at the very beginning about how this chapter of silence was sort of very difficult to listen
Yes,
to everybody
yes.
else, and what the next chapter is for you.
So yes, my first inclination after the shooting that day was to shout at the top of my lungs that this was a hate crime, and I started writing, and I tried to get things published, and no one would publish it, and then the Jewish Chronicle published it. But then we had to be quiet, and you know, that day, this is a sideline, that day at the JCC, we all went to the JCC to meet together and to see who lived and who died. And in the hallway at the JCC, I saw Tim Stevens, who is the head of the Black Political Empowerment Project. And that was a big relief, because then I knew someone was there who understood it was a hate crime. And so that took it down a level. But still, until these 4 years had passed, I really couldn't say what I wanted to say that was accumulating as other people spoke for me. So now we can talk about it. And yes, we did make a film about the aftermath of it, but we still couldn't talk about the crime, the criminal, or the trial. Yeah. And now we can.
Thank you. So I think that what I would like to ask of John, you know, like you said before, this is an unusual situation to give a victim impact statement, but also, unfortunately, you know, in the climate we're in right now, where there's more response to active shooter scenes in communities, what would you say to somebody else in your shoes who was going to be approaching a trial or a justice process similar to what you guys did? And I'll ask you to speak a little bit thinking about your colleagues as well, because a lot of you were there with us.
I think the biggest thing, at least in the preparation for testimony and whenever I actually did give a statement, was preparation. The prosecution, the investigative team did a great job of prepping us for trial, although I didn't testify. And then on my own time, just giving myself adequate amount of time to gather my thoughts and prepare my victim statement was extremely helpful.
Yeah. What advice would you give somebody who has to do that?
Prepare.
Prepare. Be prepared. Mm-hmm. It's probably true for most of your
prepare
advice
to prepare to be uncomfortable. Be comfortable being uncomfortable. Kind of like this right now.
Yes, I think that hopefully this is less uncomfortable, but I'm not sure.
If I'll repeat what I said backstage, if you want me to, but okay.
So Michele, I'm going to ask you to talk a little bit about, actually, I'm going to ask you that same question. What would you tell somebody else who was in your shoes and unfortunately was recently experiencing something and had to go through whatever waiting period and everything else, and then eventually the trial? What advice would you give them?
Oh, wow. I mean, we unfortunately had to wait 4.5 years, and I don't think any of us realized that it was going to take that long. I know COVID played a part, but the defense did their best to put off the trial starting. I would tell people to be patient, educate themselves as much as possible. None of us, except Audrey, had any law education, so just trying to find out as much information as possible. We were also blessed by the 1027 Healing Partnership that Maggie runs to have the support of her and her coworkers. The other thing that really needs to be said, and it might not always be the case, but the prosecution team for this case, I guess I know it, but I never realized it. It wasn't us against the defendant, it's the government. And so we really don't have a say, which is really hard to grasp. But in our case, the prosecution team was beyond unbelievable, and they became family because they took the time to learn about our loved ones, and their care and consideration getting us through the process was just so important.
Amy, with respect to the people who are here and the work that they do, through the trial process, what did you learn about hate-based violence and white supremacy and where we are currently, and sort of what was it that was part of the trial that helped educate you?
I think growing up in the society that we do today, it's not really prevalent. You don't really hear about a lot of people hating against anti-Semitism. You hear about it at places like this, but it's not all over the internet. So when it happened to us, it was kind of shocking. And you don't really think about the fact that you're Jewish until somebody hates you for the fact that you're Jewish. So one of the things that I learned from some of the experts, and just honestly hearing the defendants' words, were that people learn from each other. They learn from social media. They learn how to think about these hate-based ideologies from each other. And if we, as family members and victims, can go and talk to people and try to change that, then we will. We'll do anything we can, but it's just something that you don't think about often. And I remember the defendant talking about the ovens and how he killed people by the ovens, and that's not something that I would ever think about, but he thought about that when he was killing them. So these are things that go through people's minds, even in short instances. They think about all of this, and it's something that I would never have thought about before this.
And how does it change you, having now sort of faced it?
I think I'm definitely more aware of all of the hate that happens. I'm definitely more inclined to make people know that I'm Jewish, but also be a little bit afraid that people will know that I am Jewish. I think it just has educated me in more ways than I could have ever asked for, but it has also made me want to fight for it. And I need to fight for my grandmother because she's not here to fight this fight.
Thank you for that. Jodi, I'm going to ask you a question about, sort of similar to Amy was talking about how hard it was to hear some of those things, the things that we would have never even thought of or imagined, and that came out. What was your strength? How did you draw strength to get through some of those parts of the trial?
Everybody here, all of the victims' families, we had caseworkers, we had therapists, we had clergy, we had dogs. Yeah, and that support was what got me through it. It was horrifying what we heard and what we saw. Every day was brutal. I was exhausted at the end of each day. I hadn't anticipated that. But I knew every morning I would walk into the room, our family room, and I would be supported by love and by understanding and by kindness, and that's what got me through each day.
Does anybody else want to answer that question as well? Any other things besides what Jodi said?
I mean, I definitely have to echo what Jodi said. I mean, I have a great group of friends, but as the trial started, the mental exhaustion is unbelievable, and just to be with people that are going through the same thing and understand, and you're safe to cry around or to scream at, which Maggie had to deal with me. And also, I don't want to discount, I mean, not knowing the details, we had really never met the officers that responded and understood what they did and the paths that they took to make this stop. And that was quite emotional. I don't want to put you on the spot, but
I feel like that's going to happen.
No, I mean, just Andrea Wedner, who was injured and her mom was killed next to her for 4.5 years, she never met the person who came into the chapel and saw her still alive and told her to wait there until he could get a SWAT paramedic, was John. And the fact that John made sure that Andrea survived means so much, and we were really, you know, sometimes you hear about first responders not being there, but in our case, our first responders were unbelievable, and having them in the courtroom as well, sharing support.
Thank you. And you brought up that, so there's sort of 3 distinct groups that have formed in the years. And part of the division of information was that the people who had survived and witnessed had some information, the families who lost their loved ones had some information, and the first responders had some information, but they were really isolated in a lot of ways from each other before the trial. And I'm hearing you say that that was an area of strength, was being able to bring those all closer together. Is that fair to say? No, Michele?
For
Yeah.
me?
Yeah.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I mean, that's where I got all my support. You can't, I would go back to, I believe what Audrey said. There are so many, it's unbelievable to me how many people want to speak for the families and talk about how it feels, but you truly don't know how it feels. You're not getting correspondence from the Department of Justice. Like, why would that ever be happening in my life? You're not, talking to the FBI, and your world changes.
Does anybody else have anything they want to add as a final thought, or especially anything you'd want people here to know about the process?
I think it was a necessary process. I think the story needed to be told. I think it needed to be put on public record. I think for all of us, or I shouldn't say that, for myself, just having all those pieces come together, because I didn't know the story. But it had to be told.
Thank you, Jodi. And I'll sort of close with one of my learnings. I was sort of spectator. I was not, one of them, but on the other hand was there. So I'll say from my perspective, I didn't know what to expect from any of it, but I do know a little bit about trauma, and that one of the things that I really thought about a lot was that trauma is the removal of power and agency from individuals. And I do think that, knowledge and truth and information is a lot of times one of the ways that we can heal from trauma. And I learned that really through all of them and through this process. But, thinking about the justice system and the challenges of re-traumatizing, but also the withholding of information or delicately walking around the information can have its own damaging effects. So just wanted to sort of finish up with that and say a huge thank you to you all for bravely doing this, and to everybody else who was part of the community who went through it all together. That I hope you all hear that the power is togetherness and those peer relationships.
And I know. And I just want to add to the other survivors and victims that I have met in the past years and this year. It's just, we are unfortunately part of this family, but it's so nice to meet all of you, and I thank all of you that work in this field to try and help us fight hate. And just on a high note, a shout out to when we were preparing for the trial, and like, what do you need? What do you know? What do you need? And a shout out to Don Collins, who said hard candy. So, although we got in trouble for opening candy wrappers, but that was helpful information.
Thank you all. Thank you.
Thank you.